Okay, it's recording. So jumping back in. Okay, so just to recap, the topics we're covering today is the history and early influences of permaculture, permaculture ethics and principles, defining permaculture, so talking about what it is and what it isn't, and some common misconceptions about it, design steps or design methodologies, some important or key concepts in permaculture, and I'll also do a little section on social permaculture, ending with a few problems or problematic pieces associated with permaculture. And then, as I mentioned, we'll hop into questions and discussion at the end. So I'm sorry if this is a very redundant review for those of you who've already heard this spiel, but I just would like to start with a little bit about me for those of you who don't know me. So again, my name is Lucy Bardos, and I found out about permaculture probably about a decade ago when I was in a plants and peoples conservation biology class at UBC Vancouver. So I have a bachelor's in romance studies with a minor in conservation biology. And I became really enamored with conservation and ecosystems during this undergrad part of my life. And in this one class, Plants and Peoples, a girl was doing a presentation all about permaculture, and she was doing it about her urban downtown Vancouver apartment and how she was making all of these cool plans to grow food indoors, how she had rallied her building's management team to allow her to plant food plants in the very underutilized green space around the building. And she shared all of her plans and maps as part of a presentation to the class. And I just thought it was amazing. And ever since then, I just tried to take like every course and workshop that I could. So I've done a whole bunch of like short-term workshops. I also did a full 72-hour permaculture design certificate course. And I'm also part of the faculty of the Permaculture Women's Guild online permaculture course these days, which is like a self-paced online course, which actually goes way beyond like a traditional PDC, which is 72 hours. This one's like probably around double that. In my day-to-day, I'm a community project consultant, and the main piece of what I do is I work with the Okanagan Fruit Tree Project as a coordinator. And so the Okanagan Fruit Tree Project is an organization based around food security and promoting equitable access to food through rescuing produce that would otherwise go to waste. And we also have a community farm program where we grow produce for donation with the help of volunteers. But within the world of permaculture, I'm just really interested in the way that permaculture helps bring the community together. And as you'll see in this presentation, there's different facets of permaculture. Like some people get really into the homesteading part. Some people get really into designing big farm scale projects. Some people get really into the urban permaculture. And for me, what really attracts me is always the community building aspect of permaculture. So over the years, I've been part of many different permaculture work groups. I've developed a passion for cob building, and yeah, just any time that I can share permaculture with the community and bring people together, I'm there. And so as part of that, I also steward together with a team of others, the Permaculture Kelowna Facebook group, where we host meetups and workshops and different kinds of things. Okay. So enough about me. We're going to talk a little bit about how permaculture actually got started. So the term itself, permaculture, was coined in the early 70s by two naturalists called Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, who were working in Tasmania, Australia, at the University of Tasmania. And so they're the two gentlemen at the top left-hand corner of the screen. And David Holmgren was actually Bill Mollison's student. So Bill Mollison was in the teacher role, and he was a person with a very diverse background in terms of the kinds of work he had done. He had traveled a lot. He was really interested in psychology, but also ecology, and he had worked for many years as a naturalist. And he had spent a lot of time observing the landscapes around him, and really during the 60s, this was when the Green Revolution was happening. So there were all these big industrial developments happening in the world of agriculture. So machines were getting really big, and this big trend of giant monocultures was happening. And so he was understanding how devastating this was to not only local ecosystems, but looking ahead in time, he understood how this was not sustainable for communities, because depleting the soil of its nutrients obviously would result in not only a collapse of ecosystems, but also a collapse of economies and societies down the line. So they were influenced by a few different people and books, which I'm going to talk about, to come to this idea of permaculture. So the first influence that I want to talk about was Masanobu Fukuoka. And he wrote the book called The One Straw Revolution in 1975. This is the green book that you see in the middle. And he was a pioneer. So he had developed this concept called natural farming. So it was an approach to farming that worked with natural ecosystems and allowed systems to actually develop. He was vehemently against monocultures. So he always planted several types of seeds together, and he found types of plants that worked well together and supported each other as a system. He was very much against tilling, against fertilizer, against all kinds of pesticides and herbicides. He didn't ever weed, he didn't ever prune, and he had this very kind of like hands-off approach. He also pioneered a way of growing seeds where he coated them in clay, which protected them and helped them have a higher sprouting rate. And it was not just about farming, it was really a lifestyle philosophy. So his whole approach was kind of infused with different aspects of Zen Buddhism and the betterment of humankind. So he was definitely a big influence on the early days of permaculture. And then another big influence was P.A. Yeomans, who wrote a book called Water for Every Farm in 1973. And actually it was in this book where he used the words permanent agriculture to talk about a method of agriculture that was not unchanging, but it was sustainable in a way that it could continue indefinitely without negatively affecting ecosystems and communities. So he actually said permanent agriculture in his book. And that was what inspired Bill Mollison and David Holmgren to coin the term permaculture, which was a contraction at that time of the words permanent and agriculture. And so P.A. Yeomans was the founder of this concept called key line design, which captures water at certain key points in the landscape. And it's still very much used today. And he was a very strong advocate for designing sustainable water systems that regenerated earth and landscapes. Another influence was Stuart Brand, who had this counterculture magazine. He was the editor of it. It was called Whole Earth Catalog. And it was being issued during this time, and it talked all about sort of self-sufficiency, DIY, ecological sustainability. So it would have articles on organic farming, solar power, recycling, wind power, and also social movements. And then finally, as Bill Mollison and David Holmgren lived in Tasmania, they were very much influenced by the culture and land stewardship of the Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples. So what they observed was this ability of the local people to have stable food producing systems. And they also really were inspired by this whole systems worldview and the looking towards future generations. That was a part of the local Aboriginal people's culture. And this was definitely a big influence on the sort of underlying whole systems and ethical underpinning of permaculture that we'll talk about. So as I mentioned, permaculture is a contraction of permanent and agriculture, but over time it's really become a contraction of permanent and culture, because agriculture is a part of a larger human culture, and that's kind of how it's understood these days. And so I just wanted to reiterate too that perma is part of the word permanent, but in Latin that means to remain or to continue on. It doesn't refer to something that is static or unchanging. And that's like a common misconception when people first hear that permaculture includes the word permanent. It doesn't mean something that you just install and then leave, and then it just stays in its state forever. That's not possible. It just means something that's essentially sustainable in perpetuity. And yep, as I mentioned, culture is part of agriculture, but also broader human culture. So the core of permaculture are 3 ethics, which are care of the earth, care of people, and fair share. The 3rd ethic is called fair share, fair shares. Sometimes it's also called future care. Sometimes it's also called like equitable distribution of resources. But essentially it refers to not taking more than we need and kind of self-regulating and making sure that that whatever resources are available are distributed equitably. So permaculture also has a set of principles, and the image that I'm sharing right now shows the 12 permaculture principles that were developed by David Holmgren, and I think they're really good to introduce people to permaculture. However, they're not the only permaculture principles. So over the years, different permaculture teachers and practitioners have developed their own sets of principles, and some of them go up to like 60. But I think these 12 are really good to kind of give you an idea of what the main ideas that permaculture designers use when they're designing. So I'm just going to go through them. So the first one at the top, oh, and if you aren't able to see the image, every principle has its own icon, and actually everyone also has its own like proverb that's associated with it, which is a good remembering device to help you remember what it is. I don't have the proverbs with me now, so I'll just go through the principles. So they are creatively use and respond to change, observe, and that one's a butterfly, observe and interact, which is a person and a tree, catch and store energy, which is an image of a sun in a bottle, obtain a yield, which refers to if you're ever doing any kind of project, make sure that you get something out of it. That's a picture of a radish that has a bite taken out of it. Then there's apply self-regulation and accept feedback, which is a picture of planet Earth. The next one is use and value renewable resources and services, which is a picture of a horse. Then there's produce no waste, which is a picture of a worm. Design from patterns to details, which is a picture of a little spider on a web. And I just want to pause really quickly at this principle, because this one's really, really important. Patterns are a huge part of permaculture. Usually whenever you do a permaculture course, you'll have like a whole big lesson on pattern recognition, because there are so many different patterns in nature that explain the way that different energies in nature flow, that explain the way that plants grow, and help you kind of predict what's going to happen next when you're looking at a system. So pattern recognition and pattern literacy are a really big part of permaculture. The next point is integrate rather than segregate, and that's a top-down view of people holding hands. The next one is use small and slow solutions, which is a picture of a snail. Next, we have use and value diversity, which is a hummingbird close to a flower. And then we have use edges and value the marginal, which is a picture of a road or a stream flanked by some mountains. And this is another really, really important principle, use edges and value the marginal. And this is one that I'm going to explore more in depth a little bit later in the presentation. So with these principles, essentially they're kind of like guidelines or little helpers when you're creating a permaculture design that kind of help you move on to the next step and inform like what the design is going to look like and what you should be thinking about when you're designing. So I'm going to take a little pause here and I'm going to ask, what is the definition of permaculture? So this is a topic where there isn't one correct answer. I have a few definitions that I'm going to share with you, but I'm wondering if anybody who is either familiar with permaculture or maybe isn't even that familiar with permaculture but thinks they know what it is. Does anybody want to share their definition of permaculture? And I can't see you guys, so you'll just have to unmute yourselves if you want to.
I'll try.
Okay.
I think permaculture is an approach and a way of thinking of connecting with the planet and with people around you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a really good one. Love it. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I will share some definitions with you guys then. So this is the shortest one that I could come up with. Permaculture is designing with nature rather than against it. And this kind of definition really harks back to the the coining of permaculture in the early days, which saw that modern agriculture really worked against nature. And permaculture was countercultural because it was all about designing with nature, with the flows of nature, and creating human sustaining habitats that mimicked ecosystems. So my second and a little bit longer definition is that permaculture is an approach to design modeled on ecosystems and based in an ethics of care towards the earth and all of its inhabitants. So in this definition, I zero in on the design aspect being modeled on ecosystems. And I think it's also important to include the ethics piece in definitions. So here's another definition, slightly longer this time. Permaculture is a philosophy of working with rather than against nature, of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless labor, of looking at plants and animals and all their functions rather than treating any area as a single product system. And this is actually by Bill Mollison, and I really like this definition because it really highlights the sort of systemic thinking part of permaculture. And then this last definition here is a definition of permaculture that was published in Permaculture magazine, the North American edition. So it says, permaculture offers a way to connect the dots between the relationships of all things. It offers a roadmap to a permanent culture, a life that is not only sustainable, but regenerative. It replenishes resources rather than depleting them. So again, there is no one correct definition of permaculture, but I think it's important to zero in on certain aspects of it when we're talking about it with other people. So I have, oh, that one's coming up in a little bit. I have a bit of a formulaic definition of permaculture, but before we get to that, I'm actually going to talk about what permaculture is not, because I think, especially in like the last decade, permaculture has really become almost like a buzzword where most people have heard about it, but maybe don't have a clear or specific idea of what it is. So I just want to make clear that permaculture is not synonymous with any particular technique or set of techniques, such as permaculture raised beds or lasagna gardening or hugelculture, which are common. They're common results of a permaculture design, but in and of themselves, they are not permaculture. And this is something that I actually myself had to teach myself, because when I was very new to permaculture, all that I would see was the result of people's designs. So I would see these cool garden techniques being implemented, and I would think, oh, that technique is a permaculture technique. But actually, that's not true. The design process is permaculture, and what results from it is permaculture. But one single technique that you're using is just a technique. And I'm highlighting this because there's a trend, and I'll talk about this later in the presentation too, of people associating specific techniques and calling them permaculture techniques when they're really a traditional or even indigenous technique that's been used for thousands of years, which is part of the problematic piece of permaculture. So yeah, I just wanted to make that really clear. And when my husband Victor and I were traveling in Europe in 2016, we were working on a bunch of farms, and a lot of people there who were owners of farms, they saw on our little like biography that we sent them that we were interested in permaculture, and they would say, oh, can you build us a permaculture raised bed? Or, you know, identify permaculture by these kind of like, quote unquote, like sexy pictures that they had seen. And it just made me pretty uncomfortable. So it's always something that I want to talk about when I'm talking to a group and giving an intro to permaculture. Another thing that permaculture is not is dogmatic. So permaculture, the result of a permaculture design process can look different. So there's many correct outcomes of a design process. There is not one like correct permaculture way of doing things. Like if you think of a landscape, like a backyard or a farm, if I designed it as a permaculture designer, it would look different than if someone else designed it who was a permaculture designer. And neither one of our designs would be like more correct. They would just be more personal to us, and they would always be dependent on what we observed about the land and what we were trying to accomplish with our designs. So yeah, not dogmatic at all. Like there's many correct pathways that permaculture can take. This point is kind of connected to the first point. Permaculture is not just a cool way of gardening. Oh, I have the word gardening twice, though it might look like that. So again, just wanted to reiterate, you see a lot of cool images of gardens, and permaculture is just more than that. And I already touched on this last point a little bit. Permaculture is not finite or static. We can always evolve better and more diverse permaculture designs. Our only limit is our creativity. And this is something that Bill Mollison was very much an advocate of, that yeah, our only limit to designing is creativity. Like we can always build in more diversity. We can always build in more connections between elements. We can always combine two different systems and make them work together. We are always learning more about nature and how nature works. We're learning more about our communities. We are becoming better stewards of the land. So no matter how many years a person has been doing permaculture, they're always a student of nature, and they're always learning and improving for infinity. So this is my kind of formulaic definition of permaculture. So I put permaculture equals the analysis of current systems plus the permaculture design process plus its outcomes. So here I want to talk about the fact that permaculture is not just design, but also analysis. So it's also the ability to understand what we're seeing in front of us through a systemic perspective, essentially. And specifically, you look at a system through the lens of an ecosystem. Sometimes permaculture people talk about thinking like an ecosystem. And what that means is looking for connections, or looking for or understanding that there's missing connections happening. Understanding which things are working well together or not working well together, if a system is being managed effectively, if a system is healthy, predicting what a system is going to look like in 5 years, in 10 years, being able to sort of, just like put those analytical glasses on and really see, like, from a systemic perspective, like, what is going on here? And then that analysis can inform a design process where you understand the parts of the system that you want to change, and like think about your goals and where you want to get to with your design process. And then finally, that results in an outcome, which is like the visible thing that people who haven't been in your head or privy to your design process actually see. The image that you see on the slide, it's a side-by-side image. The left side is just an empty grain field, and the right side is a diverse food forest system. And so this is the same piece of land, and it belongs to Maddie Harland, who is the editor and co-founder of Permaculture magazine. And this is a slide that she shared at the European Permaculture Convergence in 2016, where I was lucky enough to be a volunteer. And I just thought it was a really cool way to see, like, what a permaculture design can result in. But at the same time, it's kind of shows you all the parts that you don't see of permaculture, because you see like the before and the after and like, whoa, that's so cool. But there's actually this whole like design process that has happened before you get from like A to B. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop sharing this presentation, and I want to share with you guys a permaculture project that was done by one of my students from the Permaculture Women's Guild online course, just to kind of show you all of the different steps that go into an actual permaculture design. So just bear with me for one moment. I'm just going to share a different part of the screen. Let's see here. Okay. Are you guys seeing Maura Housley's design? I think you are.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is my student Maura, who's based in Baltimore, and she completed her design a couple months ago. And I really loved what she was doing. She was designing not only her own backyard, but also bringing in a community garden project into her design and a community building aspect as well. So when you're doing permaculture, you really just dive into like who you are and what your goals are. Then you do a whole bunch of maps. So you always do like a base map where you plot out the elements, the parts of the design that are kind of fixed and permanent. You look at where your site is in a neighborhood. You do what's called a zone map, and I'm going to talk about that more later. You look at different ways that you're going to use different parts of a property. You also do sectors, which again, I'm going to zoom into a little bit more later, where you look at your different energies that are flowing through your landscape, which can be things like sun, wind, animals. You look at edges and microclimates. You do an analysis of all of the different resources that are going to help you do your project and what resources you're lacking. You do an analysis and design of water systems. You look at all of the different components and connections of the system that you're building. It can be very lengthy. You look at patterns and flows, so how you are going to move around the property, how water moves around the property. And then you start actually looking at your the parts of the design that you want to implement, the physical, different kinds of plants, animals, structures. You can also talk about the built environment, which is housing and structures. social and invisible structures. So this could be things like legal, social, community, neighbors, family, your own personal habits and energies. Technology, transportation, and energy, how does that all figure into your design? Like electricity, water, recycling food waste, transportation, financial resources, food storage. You also look at how the different elements of your system are going to be cycling different things like waste and nutrients. And then you do a planned implementation. So you might not implement your whole design all at once. In fact, you almost certainly won't unless you're very wealthy and have lots of help. It's probably going to be a step-by-step process. And usually when you're doing like a formal permaculture design, you have different phases of implementation that you think about. So I'm not going to dive too much into in depth about this, but I just wanted to show you like how involved a permaculture design process actually is. So again, just to drill home the point that like when you see a really cool garden that's been designed with permaculture, the garden itself is the outcome, but the design process is really like what informed it. So just wanted to give you a little sneak peek into that. And so yeah, her project is 39 slides long. And this was really just an intro. Like she's probably going to be fleshing this out a lot more over time and changing it and modifying it depending on new variables that might arise. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go back to my slides. Here we go. Okay, so I just wanted to take a little step back and talk about how permaculture has evolved over time. And I wanted to share this image of a permaculture flower with you. So if you see in the center of the flower, you have the 3 permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. And around the ethics, you have the 12 principles. And then spiraling out from the 12 principles, you have the different petals of the permaculture flower, which is all of the different ways that permaculture can be implemented. And I know that, you know, traditionally permaculture was applied more to agricultural spaces, gardens, homesteads, things like that. But actually you can apply the permaculture design principles and the design process to many different facets of human life and culture. So this includes building. So you could think about using natural building materials to build homes and different structures like cob, straw bale, there's hempcrete, there's rammed earth, there are so many different natural building techniques. You could be thinking about using the energy of the sun and the earth to passively heat or cool your house. You could also think about how buildings integrate into their landscapes and into their communities and actively design that. The next petal of the permaculture flower is tools and technology. So there's quite a strong movement within permaculture to look at human scale technology. So rather than like these big giant machines, look at like still technology, but things that can be used by a single person that don't require massive amounts of energy. So when my husband Victor and I were doing our permaculture design course, we built a cob house as part of the course and as a part of a natural building course that was kind of built into it. And our teacher was very adamant about this human scale. And at times it seemed like he was making things slower on purpose because he only allowed us to use like hand tools. And the only motorized tools we could use were like a drill and a chainsaw to cut up pieces of wood. But everything else was just like hammers and our own hands. And it was just to show us what's possible, because sometimes we get so used to using giant technology that we forget what's possible with just really simple tools. So technology that disturbs as little as possible. And also a part of permaculture can be an analysis of embodied energy. So permaculture really asks us to reflect and observe before we start modifying things. And as consumers, we can kind of use that permaculture mindset to look at like the things that we are using, like our computers or our cars or any technology, like where does that actually come from, and where does the metal come from, and how far did it travel, and like how many hands worked on it. That's like a whole rabbit hole you could go down, but it's really interesting using that permaculture systems frame of mind to analyze how much energy has gone into the production of some of the tools and technology that we use on a daily basis. So another petal of the flower is called culture and education. And so using the permaculture lens, you can design holistic education systems. You can place a focus on celebration, cultural connections to land, integrating land-based practices into education. Then there's another petal, which is health and spiritual well-being. And there's actually a whole facet of permaculture that's called emotional permaculture, where you use the permaculture principles to design your own sort of daily practice and to look at what your personal boundaries are and how you want to design the relationships with the people around you in your community. So yeah, fostering connectedness and community through design. The next petal is finances and economics. So there's a concept of circular economies, which is often talked about in permaculture, where you design an economic system or a piece of an economy that ensures that that money or economic energy cycles in a community rather than always leaking out. So a good example of this is like community currencies. So they're currencies that are only valid within a restricted area. And they kind of ensure that whenever you spend them, you're always spending them at local, usually small scale vendors. And they're just a way of helping support local businesses and maintaining a flow of economic energy within a community. So the next petal on the flower is called land tenure and community governance. And so with this piece, we could talk about equitable access to land. We can talk about commoning, so bringing back the use of common spaces, and a lot of other things. I'm really not going into detail because this is just an intro. But the last petal on the flower is land and nature stewardship. So this is kind of the main one that people are familiar with. So here we're talking about food and material production that regenerates soils and rebuilds ecosystems, and just a general sort of evaluation of the role of humans as part of their ecosystems rather than apart from ecosystems. So as you can see, permaculture is really diverse and a really big umbrella and encompasses many different facets, and the opportunities for using permaculture are pretty much unending. So if you are embarking on a permaculture design process, it can be pretty overwhelming thinking about where to start and how you're gonna make sure that you sort of get all the pieces that you need in line in order to create a design. So there's different design methodologies that you can use, and I'm going to share 3 with you. I think there's probably many more, but these are just the ones that I'm most familiar with. And design methodologies are essentially like a framework that you can follow, or a set of steps you can follow to guide you through the design process. So the one that is on the left is called GoBraDeem, and this one was developed by Heather Jo Flores, who's the author of Food Not Lawns and also the founder of the Permaculture Women's Guild. And so GoBraDeem is an acronym, and it stands for goals. So under goals, she asks, what's your specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, ecological, and rewarding goal for this design? Then there's observation. So use all of your senses to learn as much as you can about the design problem or challenge. Boundaries. Choose, find, change, negotiate, and establish your boundaries, both visible and invisible. Then there's resources. Everything is a resource and everything has a need. Tap into the waste stream and turn pollution into abundance. Next is analysis. Deep thought and careful consideration of the information accumulated thus far. Take your time, but don't get analysis paralysis. The next step is design. So this is where you do phase planning, overlays, looking at patterns and details, creating realistic, logical plans of action that consider all of the above information. The next step would be implementation. So we use a task-based process that moves the design from idea to reality one step at a time. The next piece is management, monitoring, maintenance, messes, mistakes. This is the place where you learn more and discover new problems to solve. And finally, evaluate and enjoy. Take a nap in a hammock, get out there and share what you've learned, then do it all again. And so this is the design methodology that I like to use. And even though she presents it in kind of a linear way, it's often has little loops where you're at a certain step and then you go back and redo previous steps. So you might be at the analysis stage and realize that you actually haven't observed everything that you needed to observe. So you might go back to the observation stage. You might have to reevaluate your boundaries at a certain point in the design or find more resources. So again, it's not necessarily a linear process. And for people who don't like linear things, the image on the right, which is called the design web, is another design methodology which kind of does away with the whole notion of a linear process of design. So this is called the design web, as I mentioned, and it was developed by Luby McNamara, who is a permaculture teacher and a wonderful lady, also the author of a book called People in Permaculture, and a new one, I think that's called Cultural Emergence, I believe. And so her design process is very much like including what you need to include, but it's not necessarily all going to happen in a series of neat steps. So I'll just list off what her design aspects are, which are vision, allow yourself to dream and create goals, helps, identify the things that are going to help, limits, identify the things that might block your path or keep it small or slow it down, patterns, identify the helpful and unhelpful patterns, ideas, gather inspirations, principles, look through the lens of each one. So that would be the permaculture principles. Integration, bring it all together. Action, make a plan for getting things done. Momentum, how to keep going. Appreciation, focus on things to be thankful for. Reflection, evaluate progress. Pause, incorporate times of rest and rejuvenation. So I really like the design web. I find it a little bit harder for me personally to navigate because I do like a little bit of directionality, but for people who work very intuitively, the design web is a great design methodology to follow. And then this one is called SADMET. So it again is another acronym, and this is the design methodology that was taught to me during the permaculture design course that I took. So SADMET just stands for survey, analysis, design, implementation, maintenance, evaluation, and tweaking. And it's presented here as two kind of circles. So the SADM part, survey, analysis, decisions. I learned this as design, but I guess when you're making decisions, you're also designing. So yeah, in this image, it says decisions, but I was taught it as design. You do the SADM part as one loop, and then the sort of maintenance, evaluation, and tweaking is a constant loop that's always happening because you're always maintaining whatever the outcome of your design is. You're always evaluating if it's working well. You're always making adjustments or tweaking. So I think this is kind of like the simplest methodology you could use, but also doesn't quite bring in all of those cool permaculture principles into it. So just to kind of recap some key elements of permaculture, a really important one is ecological succession. So in a forest or in any ecosystem, there's always a process of succession that's happening, which is the sort of maturing of the ecosystem from the very first stages all the way through the the development of a mature system that sustains throughout time. And usually when we're doing a permaculture design, we think about that. So if we're planting, let's say, a food forest, which is a common project that people undertake in permaculture, we're going to look at how the plants that we're implementing are going to change their ecological roles over time. So we might start out by planting annual plants while we get our perennial or long-lived plants going. And we understand that over time, our longer-lived plants are going to become more dominant, while we're going to have less less use for or less frequently harvest annual plants. We also know that when we first plant trees, they're not going to be usually able to give us sustenance or a yield right away. We might have to wait several years. So we have to design for that. If we're really looking for like food yields from a system, we have to understand that the food yields are going to change over time. So if we really want to have like a fruit tree or a tree fruit yield, we are going to have to start with different kinds of yields while we wait for that fruit to mature. And this is really kind of like a moment where permaculture diverges from like mainstream agriculture. And that's not to say that you can't grow annuals in permaculture, but generally when you think about systems that work like ecosystems, you want to have at least a few perennial plants in there, because perennial plants are, they use less resources per unit of time, and they sort of require more energy at the beginning, but then they become more self-sufficient over time. And if you think about like a field of wheat, that's one species of plant, and it's an annual plant, so it's a short-lived plant that requires replanting every year. And if you're living in a zone where, if left to its own devices, nature would become a forest, you're really keeping that field at the very first stages of succession. So nature is always trying to develop and grow the ecosystem and carry on this process of succession. But if we're constantly chopping stuff down and replanting the same stuff, we're almost like holding it back from becoming itself. So in permaculture, there's always an awareness of ecological succession, and also looking at the different roles of plants and animals in the ecosystem and making sure that the roles are allowed to be expressed and developed. So another piece of permaculture is this idea of zones, or permaculture zones, or zoning. And there's generally kind of 6 accepted zones, although some people, stretch it to more. And when you're going through a permaculture design process, you go through the steps of analyzing how you're going to use different parts of your property differently. So usually zone 0 is known as the home, the kind of center of everything. It's your day-to-day living space, and you can definitely design that very consciously. Zone 1 is the sensitive and high maintenance elements, so things that you're going to need to tend to every day, like a nursery, herbs, or chickens. Zone 2 is could be annual or perennial plants, but it's something you're going to need to tend every week. So this could be things like berries, your compost pile, maybe beehives, or any other kind of elements that you would want to visit on a weekly basis, but not necessarily on a daily basis. Zone 3 includes relatively low maintenance elements of your system. So things that you might visit once a month, like nut trees, some orchards, a fish pond, things that generally don't require that much attention or energy. And then zone 4 and 5 are kind of in their own category. So zone 4 is like a semi-maintained or lightly managed area where you might visit it every couple of months. You might harvest wood from this area, or do wild foraging or wild crafting, or you might use this area as like a retreat, a place of meditation, but you're not going to do a whole bunch to it. And then finally, zone 5 is known as a wild area. So usually this is completely left untouched. It's maybe visited for leisure, but not for maintenance. So you could think of this as like wilderness zones, like mountains, any kind of like ecosystem where you really aren't interfering as a human, to the extent that that's possible. Again, this is like a very idealistic view. And obviously, if you have a property, you might not even have zones 4 and 5, especially if you live in an urban area. So your zones 4 and 5 might be off-site, and that's totally okay. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea or a picture of what permaculture zones look like. So this is actually a design that I did for my parents' house in Vancouver. So the yellow there is zone 1 is their house, and then, sorry, zone 0 is their house. Zone 1 is the little dots. So you see that's just the patio kind of areas. Zone 2 and 3 was the back and front yard. Zone 4 is the trees that are behind the property line. So this is actually not even on their property. And then zone 5, I put a little arrow saying it's a 15-minute walk away from the house. And I'm indicating the North Shore Mountains in Vancouver in this case. Another really important part of permaculture is the evaluation of sectors, which is something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And this is looking at all of the different energies that are present on a given site that will affect your design and are things that you either want to maximize or mitigate. So on this image, you'll see there's little footsteps, and that's our raccoon or deer sector, because we regularly have wildlife coming both into the back and front yard. So that would affect, obviously, the kind of things we're going to plant, because knowing that we're going to have wildlife munching on things, we're probably not going to want to plant like very succulent vegetables. In this case, we also had a flood or a soggy sector, which are the blue areas. And there's like a depression in our backyard that is often very soggy. It doesn't have any grass. It's pretty much all moss. And my parents also had a flood of the house happen a couple of years ago. So I included that as a flood sector. So thinking about mitigating that would be an important part of this design. We also have a shade sector. We have a lot of trees flanking the property, very tall Douglas fir trees that never lose their needles. So we have a very shady portion of the backyard, and that's going to influence what we plant as well. We also have a knowledgeable neighbor sector. So our neighbor to the right of us actually teaches agriculture at UBC, and he's very knowledgeable about vegetable gardening. So if we ever have questions, we can always ask him. He's usually outside if it's a nice day. So I wanted to include that as part of the design. In the back of the property, we have a golfer sector because the property backs onto a golf course. So there are people who can visually like see into our backyard and sometimes are hitting golf balls into our backyard. And it's important to take note of that when we're designing. So I included the golfer sector or the passers-by sector. So we also have, we don't have a fence, so people can enter onto the property if they want to. And that's also something important to consider. And then more as physical sectors, I included like the summer sun, the winter sun, the pathways that the sun takes. And also I have a view sector. So there's a part of the property, which is the balcony, where there's a beautiful view where you can see out all the way to the water. And so we wanted to make sure that that view is maintained and not blocked. So this is just an idea. I wanted to give you an idea of what the kinds of considerations that you make as a permaculture designer. Another very important concept in permaculture is edges, or also known as ecotones. And this is where two different ecosystems interact. So it's like the bridge between two ecosystems. And if you look at the image on the left-hand side where you see A and B as kind of a Venn diagram, you'll see that there's a bigger diversity of species in the central area where ecosystems A and B interact. And in permaculture, we actually try to maximize that because we see that the edge between two ecosystems is the most interesting or diverse. I should note that in actual ecology, we're not always trying to maximize the edge because there's certain species that can only live in a very sort of central part of an ecosystem. So if you think of like bears or wolves, they need a huge habitat and a lot of area to roam around in. And if you fragment that habitat and increase the edge, you're going to actually drive them to extinction. But on a smaller scale, on like a backyard permaculture scale or a small farm scale, maximizing the edge is actually a really good idea because it enables us to grow a much higher diversity of species. And so the top image on the right is just kind of like a forest edge to show you what I'm talking about. And then the bottom picture is a forest garden where you can't see it super well, but there's a lot of lobe-shaped garden beds that maximize the edge of the growing space and allow for more ecological niches and different species that can be incorporated into the system. So I just wanted to place a little quick focus on social permaculture before we wrap up. Because I think this is a part of permaculture that's not always intuitive, even though it's really important. And it's actually the part of permaculture that I'm really drawn to. And if you think about what I was talking about edges just now, it's kind of the edge of permaculture. It's kind of this like really fertile area, but not super well known. So I think it's just really important to focus on it because every permaculture design has social elements. And things that are known as invisible structures, such as legal systems, economic systems, social norms, and things like that, influence very strongly how we design. And very often, in my experience, the permaculture systems that I've seen that have not succeeded or are having serious issues are having those issues because the social parts were not designed correctly or were not designed in a way to actually support that system in functioning. And another really big piece of this is our inner landscape and the social landscape around us, and the fact that we, using permaculture principles, can actively design that. Permaculture principles can be applied socially. So if you think back to the principles that we were talking about at the beginning, like design from patterns to details, or value diversity, or make sure that you obtain a yield, all of those things can be done in a social way. So for example, I did a little exercise for myself going through the permaculture principles and seeing like what they reminded me of in the social sense. So I just want to share that with you. So small and slow solutions reminds me to take one step at a time and not get overwhelmed by big projects. Use and value diversity reminds me to seek common ground with people who may think differently than I. Obtain a yield reminds me to make sure that I get out of things what I put in and helps prevent burnout. Use and value renewable resources reminds me to be conscious of my consumption and to do my best to design my livelihood according to my values. Integrate rather than segregate reminds me to ask for help when I need it and to value the labor of others. Use edge and value the marginal reminds me to step outside of my comfort zone and see the possibilities where others maybe can't. Design from patterns to details reminds me to review my own patterns of behavior and consciously decide if they are beneficial or not to myself and to my relationships. So these are just some of the ways that, like, on a very personal, one person me scale, I use the permaculture principles on a daily basis. And then I don't want to get too deep into this, but permaculture is really also a conversation about our own identity and our own role in our communities. And there's this big kind of other branch of permaculture, which is called placemaking. And I don't think placemaking evolved out of permaculture, but they almost evolved like concurrently. And I always give this example in any intro to permaculture workshops that I do of the city repair project in Portland, Oregon, where a community consciously designed aspects of their neighborhood to make the neighborhood more livable. And so this all started where there was like a very busy intersection in a residential neighborhood, and the neighborhood got together and painted a big mural at this intersection, which had the effect of making the cars slow down to look at the mural. So it kind of created the effect that they wanted to see through this conscious design. And then this branched out into the creation of little micro libraries, little cob benches, because they wanted the neighborhood to be more livable and for people to have places to gather. This also resulted in like curbside gardens, and there was like a mobile tea shop where people from the community could come and get tea. There was also an issue of vandalism that was being done by some local youth, and they ended up recruiting the youth to build different projects. So they sort of, if you thought of like the youth as a vandalism sector, they redirected that energy into something that was creating positive change rather than negative change. So they used a lot of the same principles as permaculture to create this beautiful space in the community. And this is definitely one way that permaculture principles can be applied in a really cool and interesting way. And they run like placemaking courses regularly, I think on a yearly basis in Portland. Another piece of permaculture is also the creation of habits, which kind of stems back to that idea of patterns and looking at what patterns we want to continue and develop, and how we want to become better designers. So this is a graphic that was created by Heather Jo Flores, which is called Daily Habits of a Whole System Designer's Mind. And so she has this cool wheel with an eye in the middle. And the habits that she talks about are turns every answer into a new set of questions, looks at the big picture and how connections create a system, thinks about how each decision will influence the whole, seeks more information whenever new problems arise, tries to discover patterns and predict tendencies in the system, considers possible changes that will occur over time, keeps records of ideas, experiments, mistakes, and successes, and seeks many forms of feedback from multiple sources. This is like a really cool little reminder for myself. Even though I'm not always actively working on a permaculture design for like a garden or something, I feel like I'm always designing my own practice and my own daily experience in the world. And I do like to think of myself as a designer. I don't think you necessarily have to be any specific kind of designer to be like actively designing what your life is going to be like. So I just think things like this in permaculture are really useful for people who want to cultivate a designer's perspective or a designer's mind. I find them really empowering, actually. Okay, so we've gone a little bit over time, but I wanted to wrap up with talking about some problems with permaculture. And a few of these are things that have, over time, made me almost step away from permaculture several times. I always came back because I always feel like the problems I encountered created solutions as well. And that's kind of like part of permaculture. There's this slogan in permaculture, which is the problem is the solution. So finding ways of, just like in that example I gave before, like redirecting something that's negative into something positive. And that's what I've seen in permaculture. But that's not to say that there aren't issues and that there aren't things that should be talked about. So I just want to talk about a few of those now. So there's really different definitions and portrayals of what permaculture actually is. So I think because it's become this big buzzword where lots of people are practicing it and interpreting it, obviously just in the same way that there's diversity in our communities and diversity of thought, permaculture has become this very diverse tree. And so what I'm telling you about permaculture might not exactly be what someone else tells you about it. And different people just have different definitions of what it is and what it means. And I think that's a problem because people end up confused and there's not really a solution to it. But to me, one way of kind of getting around that is that you can think of permaculture as an evolving conversation rather than as something that has a static definition, which is an idea that I've kind of brought up several times in this presentation. This one's really serious, and it's something that I've struggled with a lot, which is the lack of appropriate or enough credit given to Indigenous and traditional peoples in some of the original and current permaculture texts, and by many past and current practitioners who teach the subject. I know, like, because I've done so many permaculture workshops and courses, there's definitely not enough credit given, especially coming back to that idea of techniques when you're implementing certain techniques, like even food forestry, for example. Indigenous peoples in the Americas were doing essentially what we call food forestry for thousands of years before we had a name for it. So were many people in Central Asia and places like Japan and China and like so many other parts of the world. So I think it's really important to give the proper credit. And as we're becoming more educated about appropriation and things like that, it's just important to walk with humbleness and not try to like put the stamp of permaculture on everything, which is why before I was talking about how a specific technique should not be called a permaculture technique. You should give the credit to the actual history and origins, or at least do your best to research like where a thing came from. Also, in general, many harmful aspects of society, such as sexism and discrimination based on class and race, are still reproduced in some permaculture communities. When I say communities, I mean like courses or gatherings and stuff like that, which is like the bottom line is that permaculture can still be implemented in toxic ways. So because the ethics and principles are really up to interpretation, if there's communities that are discriminatory, they can, you know, think that they're doing permaculture, but still be really discriminatory. And one of those ways is that, I mean, that I can personally talk about is there's definitely sexism in permaculture. There's definitely male dominance, and there are definitely spaces where women are not given opportunities or a voice within permaculture. This is, if you Google it, there's many articles written about this subject, and I've definitely experienced that in some courses that I took as well, which is really unfortunate because you'd think with this ethical underpinning, this wouldn't be an issue, but it's definitely an issue. But then some ways that that's being counteracted is things like the Permaculture Women's Guild, where women have come together to create a space for each other where we can like share ideas and support one another. One specific way in permaculture that women don't feel supported is with our livelihoods. We often get overlooked for seminars and collaborative projects. So we just kind of came together and started our own collaborative project, which is the Permaculture Women's Guild. So that's a positive thing. But yeah, it's just important to remember that harmful parts of society can be reproduced in any kind of sphere. And finally, there's like this hippy dippy perception of permaculture by people who are unaware of what it actually is. And this is just something that I kind of encounter. Oh, permaculture, it's like where you just like plant a bunch of things all together and then it's just like really disorderly and looks really messy and you're just hippies dancing around. I think this perception is going down over time, especially as like the stack of literature on permaculture is growing, but it's definitely still something that is a problem in permaculture, I would say. So I think that permaculture and social equity or social justice are and should be definitely linked and looked at together. There's people within the permaculture world that I really look to as inspiration for thoughts and ways of acting around this. So there's a teacher called Pandora Thomas who's really amazing and has done a lot of sort of social justice permaculture work. And her and another teacher called Starhawk said, "We cannot care for the people unless we assure justice for all people and assert the value of every person's life." So Pandora Thomas, she's the person in the middle of the photograph that shows the Black Permaculture Network. And I was lucky enough to hear her speak at the European Permaculture Convergence in 2016. where she was one of maybe like a small handful of women of color who were presenting, which again shows some of the ways that problematic aspects of society can be reproduced. But she shared about this really cool program that she designed where she wove permaculture training and principles into a program for formerly incarcerated people to empower them through permaculture design, woven together with entrepreneur skills. And it was this really beautiful, successful program. And it just made me think about the really cool ways that permaculture can be used to create like positive social change and increase social equity. And there's just some kind of guiding questions that have emerged through my research around social equity in permaculture, which is the need to ask, like, who has access to resources when we're designing any kind of permaculture design? Like, who is going to be accessing this and who will benefit from this? So that kind of like takes us back to those permaculture ethics of fair share and people care. And the fact is that food and resource systems are always political because someone always has control and access and someone doesn't. And it's just really important to design with that in mind. And then again, this idea of pattern literacy and recognizing patterns can help us interrupt harmful patterns. And it's important to consider things like environmental racism, gentrification, and food justice, and look at how permaculture designs like are part of a web of these different concepts and can create positive change. So the picture in the top is just the Permaculture Women's Guild, which I already talked about, some of the teachers from the course. The picture in the center, as I mentioned, is the Black Permaculture Network, which is a space for Black folks to learn about permaculture and empower each other and create opportunities for each other while connecting with the land, with ancestors, and yeah, just create really cool community projects. And then I wanted to highlight a local project too, which is the bottom photo there. That's Eric, who I know personally, him and his wife, Margot Tamez, who is an Indigenous poet, historian, and writer at UBCO. They have a really cool permaculture-based project in Vernon where they actually work on a First Nations reserve with the local youth. They do a lot of really cool programming with them, as well as some habitat restoration and riparian restoration. I don't know too many details about the project, but Eric has done a webinar with us before, and I'm hoping he'll do another one with us again later, where he can maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of the details of his project. So I just wanted to show that there are ways where permaculture can kind of counteract some of the problematic aspects that we see. And I wanted to kind of leave or end the presentation with that. So again, I realized that we did go over time. So thank you so much for those of you who stayed. And I wanted to open up this space now for any questions or any people who maybe want to talk about cool projects that they're working on or that they've done in the past. And yeah, I just wanted to give a quick heads up that if you have specific permaculture questions, the answer is very often it depends because there's so many variables. So as you move forward, if you continue in a permaculture path, people will like if you identify yourself as a permaculture practitioner, people will always ask you questions, and it can be kind of frustrating for them when you always answer it depends, because it's like it depends on your goals, it depends on the landscape, it depends on the soil, it depends on if you're allowed to do this and that, it depends on who your neighbors are. It's always it depends. So just a little heads up. But anyway, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and please let me know if anybody has any questions or any comments or anything you would like to say. And you can just unmute yourselves.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
It was really nice.
No problem.
Yeah, Joey's here with me too. So
hello.
trying to soak it all in.
Cool. Was the level of the audio okay?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. Okay.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Lucy. I had a little bit of background in permaculture, but it's so interesting. There's so many parallels in the worlds that I work in with different other design and work processes, like whole systems thinking and whole systems design, and living building challenge, like living buildings, which is for built environment, and it has also like a pedal structure for their work. So yeah, it's really interesting, and the images were really beautiful too. So that is helpful. I don't think it's hippy dippy anymore. A lot more people are talking about permaculture.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I think that's like, yeah, I agree. I agree. Ilana, did you want to share anything about any of the cool stuff you've worked on in the past? If you're still there, she might be away from her computer.
I'll just second the thank you, and I have to get going, but sorry. Oh, I'm not even on camera. There's the top of my head. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks. It was great. It was a really nice overview, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Maddie.
Cheers. Have a good day.
Bye. Okay, so yeah, maybe we'll just wrap it up, because I did say it was going to go for about an hour and a half, which it did, and it was just mainly me blabbing. I have a tendency to like over prepare material, so that's kind of what happened in this case, but that's okay. Hopefully it was useful for you guys. Oh, there's Alana. Hey.
I did step away momentarily, so yeah.
Oh, okay. I actually I asked if you wanted to share anything about like your own permaculture like journey or any cool projects that you've worked on in the past.
Yeah, I could, I don't know, share a little, or I don't know, maybe I'll just share quickly kind of my experience from the webinar today. And I don't know, like one of I'm a permaculture designer, but it is really easy to kind of get, I don't know, sucked in by the mainstream, and to forget about all the different layers that you're meant to be paying attention to, like what is an actual permaculture design, and it can be challenging to take that step back. I think especially in the context of our world and how it works and how time is money and everyone wants to just plow ahead and get going right away. And also something I've really noticed this spring, my work is really picking up, and I've had some clients where like one part of the couple wants to do permaculture and the other part of the couple isn't like really, they don't have that mentality. And so a large part of my work is educating people and sharing the benefits of, the reasons why we might want to passively harvest water and filter it through the landscape and do all these things. But yeah, it's challenging in our world of just like get her done, to work with all those different dynamics, and also to slow yourself down and be like, okay, no, like all of these things need considering, and that is permaculture, and to be really strong with those boundaries and ethics. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really good observation. I think it is hard. It's really hard to like embody these things that like we learn from permaculture when we're like faced with a world that doesn't prioritize those things. Whether it's like on a small scale with with certain people, or whether it's like just like in society in general, it is really hard to like slow down, and like if you're designing something to go through a process of observation, a lot of time like you just don't have the ability to do that. So I don't know. I think a part of it is like trying to do that as best as we can, but also like not worrying about being perfect and getting it right every single time. Oh, it's our foster kitty. Nigel. We're fostering a cat in case anyone doesn't know.
Is he going to a home?
We might keep him.
You might?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I actually just wanted to wrap up with like a few book recommendations if anybody like was interested in learning more about permaculture. I just have 3 books and they're kind of on like a scale of land to social. And so my land go-to book is called Gaia's Garden by Toby Hemingway. And this book is like, as you can see, has been very used. It's just a really, really good like way of introducing people to the concept of permaculture and really practical ideas for like suburban scale or urban scale permaculture. So Gaia's Garden, really good. Then for more like community project type stuff, this book is Food Not Lawns by Heather Jo Flores, which isn't like a specifically permaculture book, but it talks about permaculture in it, and it just has a lot of ways where you can do cool like food and garden based projects in your community and make the best use of the limited resources that you have. If you're like a nonprofit or an individual or a member of a volunteer group, it's just very practical, like DIY community building garden type stuff. And then the last one, if you're ever interested in like very social parts of permaculture, is this one, which is called Change Here Now by Adam Brock. And it's exclusively about social permaculture. And it's kind of like almost an encyclopedia of different like social movements and social topics that like can inform permaculture designs. So it's really good. It's one where you don't have to like read it to cover. You just kind of flip to the areas that are interesting to you. So yeah, Change Here Now. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. So thank you again, whether you're in the webinar or you're watching remotely thereafter. Thank you so much. If you want to learn more about permaculture, you can follow us on Rhizome Eco-Social Education Society's different platforms like RESES.org or Rhizome Eco-Social on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.